Welcome back. This session deals with evangelism. I'm going to take it for granted that you didn't come here to learn how to do evangelism. That's part of who you are. That's why you're here. That's why you're going where you're going. You're almost certainly convinced of the value of sharing the gospel in word and deed, and likely have a measure of gifting in that area. That's why I'm going to go back and talk again about our keywords. First, access. How is access part of evangelism? Well, to start, access is a significant aspect of the gospel itself, addressed as it is to whosoever will accept it. And it tells them that it's theirs. Let the one who is thirsty come and drink. Whoever wishes, let him take. Once desire to come to Jesus is granted, access seems to be assumed. And Jesus is not just the way to God, but the way to God for everybody. There's not only no way for a person to come to God other than Jesus, there's no person for whom Jesus is not the way. So if you're called to spread the gospel, recall that it's a gospel of universal access that you're called to spread. The scope of the gospel also involves access. Jesus' followers are tasked with providing access to the gospel to everybody. It's out of obedience to that great commission that many of you began on this road that you're on now. But bear in mind that this great commission does not have any loopholes for difference. Our second keyword was design. How does evangelism involve design? And well, if you're doing group evangelism, then there's a lot of design you put into the environment and the presentation. In small group or personal settings, you've got the room or the space you're going to use, the time you choose, the method you use. Basically, anything you make a plan to do for which you're not following like an IKEA-type instruction sheet is going to involve design. Physical access is probably the easiest to illustrate. If you hold an evangelistic meeting in a second-floor building that doesn't have a lift, then you've excluded some people by design. Ouch. Didn't mean to do that. But there are other forms of disability or other forms of difference that are also not typically accommodated for, at least not ahead of time. But if we use our own abilities, yours and mine, as a baseline to solve a problem or to think about how people are going to receive the gospel, then you're reflecting what's called an ability bias. This approach will probably work pretty well for people of similar abilities and circumstances, but it could exclude a lot more people, maybe even a wider group of people. So it's not a matter of caring, it really is a matter of design. Yeah, I know this is a segment on evangelism, but that's just the point. When you do evangelism, you're engaging in a process that you will have designed to transmit a message of universal access. So if you end up presenting the gospel in a way that's inaccessible to some of the people around you, there's a significant gap between the gospel's stated purpose and the reality of who can actually access your proclamation of it. So probably you would think about a special kind of presentation for people who can't get to the gospel presentation for normal people. Face it, that's pretty much our default assumption. I can tell you it was mine for a lot of years. But even the existence of that gap between the gospel of universal access and presentations of it that exclude some people by design, that gap has a very concrete effect. And the fact is that some people in the place that you came all that way to proclaim the gospel will get this message. This thing is not for you. It's not for people like you. You're not particularly needed there. So, I pray that your context would be impacted through your countercultural proclamation of the gospel. But how much more powerful would it be if people see it lived out before them in churches and communities that respond to Jesus' command in Luke 14, by bringing in the blind and the lame and the deaf and the leper and the other culturally disenfranchised and rejected and broken people. How does Jesus' proclamation of the gospel illustrate inclusion and exclusion? In the Beatitudes, Jesus unpacks the ethics of a kingdom that is normalized not by exclusion and power, but by inclusion and by service. Jesus overturns exclusionary practices and models a radical form of inclusion. With Jesus, outsiders who bore the label of lepers or women or crippled, they're not labeled like that anymore. Instead, whomever Jesus encounters, at the moment of that encounter, they experience welcome. They experience an invitation to be with Jesus, to be with God. And the message of salvation itself comes to us from the margins. I love the story of Nathaniel when he asks Andrew in John 1, can anything good come out of Galilee? No, that was because most good people, regular people, normal people, like priests and Pharisees, basically thought about Galilee. Nothing good comes out of that place. And among those people, throughout the New Testament, we see evangelism pursued first to the poor and the dispossessed and the oppressed first. It's almost like they were the most able to understand the meaning of the gospel. So Galilee was not a coincidence. Responding to the reality of the margins should really inform all of our efforts at evangelization. So if we're going to go where Jesus goes, we will need to prepare to take the gospel to the marginalized, to the least reached people in our societies, to the dispossessed, the disinherited, the nobodies, the oppressed, the people who are typically overlooked by society and pushed to the margins. And probably the most significant such group is people with disabilities. In my experience, one of the toughest barriers to breakthrough are the assumptions that we make about people, particularly other people, as we pursue evangelism. We've assumed that our own lives are kind of neutral ground, morally, that we're normative, that we're average. And in some cases, maybe even just approaching ideal. The more average we are, the more regular we are, the more normal we are. So that when we work to benefit others, oftentimes that work is seen as work which will involve them to become more like us. Now, in the West, we really fear the notion of dependency. People receiving social assistance, people with visible disabilities, one of the things they get labeled at is they're needy, they're dependent, as if that's bad. While our pervasive reliance on cars and telephones and electricity and buildings, we don't look at that as being a dependency. If we could just begin by celebrating, not categorizing our diversity as created human beings, some conditions that we now call disabling would instead represent fresh approaches to the world, which could enhance our appreciation of what it means to be human. I mean, even a person who is totally dependent on others for all aspects of care can be honored for providing the opportunity to generate connection, compassion, and love among those around her. If our assumptions about the people that will participate in your mission and evangelistic activities are unchallenged, it's easy to fall into exclusion habits, even as you set out to serve. So, what might happen if I adapt my approach to evangelism to include people with disabilities? First, you'll reach more people, and you will be engaging an unreached people group. It's been suggested that the largest unreached people group in the entire world is people with disabilities. It's a people group that is present in every single community of the country to which you're going. According to some reports, 90% of people affected by disability don't attend church. But what I can tell you with confidence about the place you're going, even if I don't know where it is, I can tell you that people affected by disability want to come to Jesus and want to come to church and want to be part of the faith community that you're going to be initiating at the same rate as anybody else. But they don't, and they won't, because of the barriers that exist. And I can also tell you that 90% of whatever churches are established in the place you're going have zero intentional outreach to the disabled in their community. Consider what Jesus did when he first went to Jerusalem. In John 5, his first reported stop wasn't the temple. It was the pools of Bethesda, where we read a great number of disabled people used to lie. Pro tip from the master: when you get to where you're going, look around to spot the places where you might actually encounter, not be sheltered from, people with disabilities. Where do great numbers of disabled people congregate? You might want to find that out. I'll give you a second result, that what might happen if you can open up your evangelism to be more inclusive. Practicing inclusion will foster more faithful proclamation of a holistic gospel. If this gospel, which was divinely designed to be universally accessible, is only proclaimed within a bandwidth of normalcy, then the radical implications of it will be under or unappreciated. And that is going to affect both the content and the transmission of our message. What is the gospel? Well, Jesus referred to it, among other things, as good news to the poor. So how exactly is the gospel good news to the disabled? Thinking through that a bit may help your own appreciation of the depth of the gospel and its implications. It may also help you think more inclusively at the front end and thus avoid those exclusion habits. If we aren't in church fellowship and in spiritual relationship with people with disabilities, it's easy to think that salvation for them must somehow involve being healed. You read the Bible with people with disabilities, as I have, and you begin to see, when you look at it together, that salvation isn't just the fixing of a problem. It's a full welcome into the family of God. And what happens in each of these instances is that societal, structural, economic, political, and religious barriers are removed. That's an intrinsic part of what salvation is to a person with disabilities. And we see that in Jesus' outreach. Those barriers that we're talking about, they don't just keep those other disabled folks out, but they also keep us temporarily able-bodied folks from welcoming and being hospitable to them, as we're called to do. Now, even when Jesus did accomplish physical healing, the physical healing and the forgiveness of sins provided access to God's redemption to those who had been explicitly excluded from the temple before because of their condition. So as we follow Jesus' example and we welcome those excluded by cultural standards of worth as part of our evangelistic efforts, we're going to see that our own appreciation for the power of that gospel is enhanced. Thirdly, I really believe that mission continually needs innovation. And evangelism methods that will engage people with disabilities will help you innovate and provide and produce methods that really are better for everybody. Sharing the gospel in a way that will be accessible to people with disabilities will make you better at sharing the gospel, period. Let's imagine you're doing evangelism in your new context, and you notice we don't seem to have a whole lot of disabled people coming here. Your new neighbors will probably tell you that those people, that they wouldn't want to attend an event like the one you're putting on because it would probably make them uncomfortable. They'd feel different, people would look at them funny, talk to them funny. In other words, the group gets blamed for their differences, And then their segregation gets justified by claiming it's something that they chose. Plan B. What if events are set up presuming that neighbors with disabilities belong alongside other folks from the start? Well, it'd take some extra work to figure out how to accommodate people who seem at first glance maybe too different to blend in with the average folks. It'd take creativity. It'd demand dialogue with these people that needed accommodation. It would compel relationship. It would also create safe place. It would create sanctuary. Creativity, dialogue, relationship, sanctuary. Tell me that doesn't sound like a good foundation for sustainable mission work. So try starting with the expectation that everyone who participates belongs, as opposed to the assumption that everybody who participates is similar. When your regular folks get more familiar, they're not going to stare. Just the exposure itself will help foster familiarity and comfort. And I believe that that's why, in my experience, literally 100% of church folks that I personally surveyed who have started disability ministries, and I asked them about the experience, 100% respond, we're glad we did this. I have never seen one church that put in place a disability ministry and then walked it back and thought it was a bad idea. The scriptures are the story that goes from creation to ultimate redemption. And it's in that story that we find our own salvation. And this salvation is all about a relationship that's initiated and sustained by God. It's about an unequal partnership between an all-powerful divinity and a limited creation. Salvation is not the story of like seeking like. It's the story of irreducible difference. And this difference is precisely the prerequisite for community. God created humanity as a community where difference is fundamental. Difference is the very foundation of relationship. And it doesn't need to be overcome in order to create community. But I don't want you to think that means it's going to be easy. The questions you might be asking yourself now as you're pondering this are just as tricky as you think they are. What about people with profoundly low intellectual abilities? How do we know if they believe or what they believe? What do we decide if our work involves baptizing people? What do we do? Well, I will give you fair warning. Experiences at the margins will require you to rethink traditions that were only designed to work at the center. That makes perfect sense. And this will not be the only troubling question of this kind you're going to encounter, believe me. But first, theologically, I cannot believe that cognitive impairment can hinder anyone from approaching God because God is the one that's doing the approaching. But more to the point, how do we know what this person believes? How do you know what I believe? How do we know what anybody believes? Well, you observe them. You interact with them. You interact with them in their own language, not ours. And I've watched believers from a lot of different Christian traditions and a lot of different places struggle with how you assess a person's understanding of these rites of passage and what they mean. And it's the uncertainty about this that often results in keeping persons with intellectual disabilities from fully participating in the life of the church. I've experienced this in our ministry in Ukraine, where I had friends who were parents of a kid with Down syndrome. And they were told when they proposed that he be baptized, that he could not be baptized. And the single reason given was he could not verbally articulate his testimony. And then when they said, well, if he cannot receive baptism, the parents very sincerely and heartfelt asked, so what place does my child have in the kingdom of God? And according to those parents, the pastor had no verbal answer himself. He couldn't spell it out. That can't be right. But even within our own traditions, you will often find a lot of unused or underused resources, often in the form of something like a minority report of one sort or another during the formative phases of our faith tradition's development. Christians have always seen faith as a gift to be received, apart from individual effort or accomplishment. Faith is a gift. It's something from the Spirit that we share. It's not just a matter of my or your individual intellectual assent. And that's why questions about the image of God are so important. It also shows how attending to rather than avoiding what seem like the tricky bits of mission will often draw you back to the best parts of your faith. So salvation is, among other things, the restoration of the marred image of God that we all reflect. And that image we read in Scripture is most fully reflected in Jesus, who welcomed those who were excluded and was even himself excluded on a cross. So from this, I would challenge you to consider that access and inclusion are basic characteristics of the image of God in us. I mean, since we are able to be like Jesus, bearing the image of God means to include all people, especially those with disabilities. Now, I was brought up kind of thinking that the image of God was rooted in rational thought, or moral behavior, or responsibility, or creativity. But if the image of God is rooted in any of those things, many people with Down syndrome, for example, might be excluded from even possessing the image of God. But the image of God is that in a person, that in every person, which constitutes him as someone loved by God. The image of God transcends the ability to reason, to think, to will, or even have a moral framework. God creates people according to his own image, and that's what gives people their value. That's what provides their dignity and their destiny. Resurrection isn't about perfect bodies, which would include the mind. I mean, Jesus showed his disciples his scars after the resurrection. I mean, that in itself shows that he didn't die and rise again just so people could have perfect bodies. He did it so that they could have eternal, incorruptible, glorious, spiritual, and powerful life with God. So Christians with intellectual disabilities can trust that the hope of resurrection isn't a perfect mind, but an incorruptible and new mind that's free from sin and meant to glorify God forever. Consider how the gospel came to people like the Ethiopian eunuch and Zacchaeus. They were both seen as damaged people by their bodily form. The Ethiopian eunuch, because of being a eunuch, which meant he was excluded from the temple. And in many places, Zacchaeus, who was, the gospel takes pains to point out that he was short, that in its day was seen as a disability of sorts. Something that meant he was just different in a way that probably could have been disabling. But consider how the gospel came to these folks. The gospel came to them, and they didn't get fixed. They weren't brought into conformity with the social standards of beauty and desirability, but they were transformed while remaining just as they were. What a testimony to the power of God to save all of us normal folks from our discriminatory attitudes and inhospitable actions and in exclusionary practices. So in conclusion, remember, you're a designer and an evangelist, even if you don't have either of those job titles. You have the power to send messages of inclusion or messages of exclusion with the way you think about the design of how you pursue your mission. And even if you aren't planning any concrete ministry to or with people with disabilities, taking them, both their needs and their potential, just into account in the initial phases of your cross-cultural ministry will help you have a more inclusive ministry, and one which will actually be better not just for people with disabilities, but better for everybody.